This is Invisible Inc., the podcast for under-resourced women entrepreneurs. And I'm your host, Shubha Chakravarti, founder of Achieve. Join me as I talk to women entrepreneurs about the nuts and bolts of their journeys and to experts who will give you insights that are hard to find anywhere else. Let's jump in. Are you the founder of a STEM startup suddenly dealing with the VC pipeline closing up? Are you intrigued by the influx of huge government funding, especially into climate-related fields, but even other sectors more broadly? Have you ever tried diving into the wide world of government grants, but quickly realized you're way out of your depth? In this episode, Christine E.B. Howard, seasoned grant professional and founder of E.B. Howard Consulting, talks about the hows and whats of government grant funding for-profit startups, what you need to know and do to prepare your startup for grants, what startup founders miss about the must-have factors to qualify for government grants, especially for STEM startups, and much more. Now, here's Christine. Hello, Christine. Welcome to Invisible Inc. We're so excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So you've done a lot of work in helping for-profits in particular access non-dilutive grant funding. So for those of us who aren't familiar, can you just give us a quick overview of what the landscape is of government funding and where one might find these sources?
Yeah, so real quick, non-dilutive funding means funding that won't take equity from your small business or startup. And that might be loans or debt or grants. And in this particular case, we're not talking about loans or debt or anything that's going to be credit bearing in any way, shape, or form. We're just talking about grants, maybe some contracts, and that's going to be the focus of where my domain is. Where people find startups, small businesses will find non-dilutive funding. There's a couple of different locations to find the funding. Of course, grants.gov. When you go into grants.gov, make sure you select small business or for-profit entity, and that'll help filter out some of the other things that are meant for research institutions or nonprofits. Not all federal agencies will put their opportunities into grants.gov. For whatever reason, I don't know what the disconnect or why there's a disconnect there, but there is. If you know an agency that you really want to work with, like DoD is a really good example of this. Not all DoD opportunities end up in grants.gov. Sometimes you can find them in sam.gov. Sometimes you find them on the agency's website themselves. So there's a couple of different areas that you have to look into. It's not overly obvious, and it does require a little bit of detective work and sleuthing on federal websites. Of course, if you're in a state that supports economic development and entrepreneurialism with for-profit entities, you can always root around on your state's website. New York State has lots and lots of funding I would say they have tax breaks and incentives and things going on that may be advantageous to an innovator or a startup, but there's lots of things going on in different states. Then there's private sector. I use Johnson & Johnson as a really good example. They have challenges that come out that's meant for for-profit entities. So depending on your space and what you're doing, look to the private sector, look to foundations. Kauffman Foundation is a really good example of one that supports entrepreneurs. But it does take a bit of detective work and sleuthing around to figure out what's out there. It's not a one-stop shop.
You gave an excellent example of the difference between some of the types of assistance as well as the entities that provide that assistance. Are there big differences, notable differences between grants in particular that come from the federal government versus maybe some of these other state or local governments?
Yes, as far as what they're looking for, yes. Dollar amount may play a role as well. And of course, then there's the whole registration process at the federal level. There's the mandatory sam.gov. And I would encourage anyone seeking any type of funding, get the registration done right away. Even if you're not planning on seeking government grants for another year, do it now. It'll save you a lot of headache down the road. Just get that out of the way. But everyone's got different registration requirements, timelines, award amounts, The applications are different from each other. I wish there was a one size fits all, but there isn't.
So let's say that you're a startup founder, you're starting the search for grant funding in particular. Is there a hierarchy that you would recommend to a founder to say, start here and then kind of go down the tree?
Well, there's a couple of things I would encourage them to think about. What is it that you're doing? And we always advise clients, funding should fit you. You shouldn't fit to the funding. You can get yourself into a lot of trouble as a business owner, having too many irons in the fire and spreading yourself too thin. Not a wrong approach, but without thinking through the funding opportunities. I don't know that there is necessarily a hierarchy, but it really depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something novel and innovative, say, for example, you're doing something with machine learning or AI, you might be better off looking at the federal government and maybe your state as opposed to the private sector, although private sector may have something that fits what you're doing as well. If you are like a consumer goods startup business, a bakery, maybe your clothing shop or a consulting firm, funding isn't going to be the same for you as it would be for an innovator where there's a potentiality for large scale economic impact. That doesn't mean there isn't funding there. It just means it's different and maybe not as plentiful. If you are consumer goods, not doing something novel and innovative, say you're Joe's Pizza Shack, start at the state and look to private sector. Whereas if you're doing something novel like machine learning and detecting cavities in teeth, maybe the federal level is the place to start. But it really depends on what you're doing and what your industry is and what your sector is. Talk with mentors and advisors that could guide you on where do you start to look for non-dilutive funding. My default response is look at federal, then work your way down. But again, it depends on your industry and it depends on what you're doing.
So one thing that kind of came through loud and clear is this affiliation or affinity between scientific, technological types of domains and the greater availability of federal funding. And my understanding is the SBIR, STTR program is a pretty big part of that. So can you just give a quick overview for those of us who aren't familiar what the SBIR, STTR programs are, how they differ from each other?
So the Small Business Administration supports small business innovation research, SBIR, and then the STTR element is the tech transfer element of it. Essentially, it's the same funding, it just depending on what you're doing specifically. But that funding comes through the Small Business Administration and is administered to 11 participating agencies. So National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, DoD, Department of Education, DOT, Department of Homeland Security, name an agency, there's probably SBIR funding in some way, shape, or form for for-profit innovators. SBIR is meant to demonstrate, there's a couple of different things that it does. The big ultimate goal is to spur on economic development and innovation. That is the ultimate goal, with an idea that whatever you're developing or working on, there's a commercialization element for it. So take your product to market. And there's a couple of different stages. They refer to them as phases. So don't confuse that with clinical trials, a little different. So they have a phase 1, which is a small pool of money. It can be anywhere between 100 to maybe 275, maybe upwards of 300. For a small period of time, like 6 months, maybe a year, depending on what's going on, just to demonstrate feasibility or proof of concept. Like, is what you're proposing to do, could it work? And this is a chance for you to receive some money, to pay the people to do the work, to demonstrate that there's a potentiality there. And then there's a phase 2, which is a larger pool of funding, can be anywhere from $750,000 to well over $1 million on a larger timeline, more like a year to 18 months. And that is focused on commercialization and taking your product to market. And of course, a little deeper R&D is involved. The whole purpose of those dollars are for you to pay people to do the work to get the outcomes. You're not buying equipment or supplies or renting a building. You're going to pay developers or engineers or scientific experts, that whoever's on your team, to do the work. And the other notable thing about SBIR is that it's meant to be done in the US by US citizens or those that are eligible to work in the US, meaning they have a green card status, and that the company is owned by US citizens. So everything's got to happen within the United States. Now, the STTR element of this, not too far different, phase 1, phase 2, and there's even phase 3s for SBIRs. Sometimes they're funded, sometimes they're not. Most of the time they're not. Just they're unfunded project periods with support from the agency. I guess that's a better way of saying it. But the STTR, you might be an academic affiliated with a research institution, and that whole purpose of that STTR is for you to launch your product into the market space, but you don't have a research institution involved. When you have an STTR, that means there's a substantial amount of work that's going to be involved with a research institution. Maybe you're using labs, there's space, whatever it is. There's a little bit deeper nuance to it, but if you're affiliated with a university, you're a professor, you might be bound to use the STTR element, just given the nature of your contracts. Whereas if you're an entrepreneur, startup, and you're not affiliated with a university, you're not obligated to use a university or a research institution, SBIR might be the path for you. That doesn't mean you can't partner with a research institution as a subcontractor, but there's just different paths. Depends on what you're doing, where you are as an innovator. If you're out on your own or you're a part of a research institution. There's a little deeper nuance to that, but that's the overall high-level view of it.
Excellent. Really helps clarify a lot of things. So if I'm Jane Doe, who has a brilliant idea in machine learning as applied to transportation, but I'm not a PhD student or a professor, it sounds to me like the smarter path is maybe try to find an SBIR, and failing which, try to go find the STTR route, in which case I might need to find some kind of research university or...
You would already be affiliated with a research institution for the STTR. If you're not affiliated, then yeah, SBIR might be the path for you, depending on what you're trying to accomplish.
So let's say I found a potential opportunity through the SBIR. What should I as a founder keep in mind when I'm deciding, should I pursue a grant or not? I mean, there's clearly pros, cons, trade-offs. What does that picture look like?
It's a big picture, and there's a lot there to take in. Just like pursuing Series A funding, venture capital funding, or angel investors, when you get funding, there's work involved. So this isn't just winning the lottery. There is some risk involved. There's no guarantee that you're going to be funded, and no reputable grant writer or grant professional is what they should be called, can guarantee, promise, or imply that you're going to be funded. But there is going to be a substantial amount of work involved, and probably just as much work as would be involved if you were securing Series A, the type of documentation, surrounding yourself with knowledge experts, making sure that you understand the commercialization space for your product. What is the potentiality? What's the cost going to be when you sell it? Are you licensing it? One of the upshots of securing funding that doesn't take equity from you is if you are going after venture cap or angel investor dollars, this will help de-risk their investment, because they'll see that the federal government has already given you a pool of money to demonstrate outcomes. And that makes it a little bit more palatable to your investors. If you are seeking investors, it's helpful for that. But as far as like the type of work that's involved, there's a series of registrations, there's documentation requirements, and that's just even before you even start the application. That's a whole different amount of work that's involved. And of course, you have to be really good at time management.
Excellent. So you said this feels more akin to a Series A type of lift in terms of the preparation. And yet, one of the things you mentioned earlier is if it's a phase 1, the amount of funding is much less than a typical. So that's a trade-off right there. So if I'm a founder, how should I make that trade-off?
Again, it's about giving up equity. So when you're going for pre-seed or Series A, you're giving up equity. This is not giving up equity. And of course, it's the federal government, and there's all sorts of documentation requirements before the federal government gives up their money for you to demonstrate your outcomes. But yeah, it's paperwork heavy. And that's why, yeah, it's a smaller pool of money, but you're not giving up that equity element. And that's the trade-off there for you. Do you want to give up the equity? And again, there's no guarantee that you're going to get funded either. So it's a lot of work. A lot of people don't get funded, unfortunately. Like the success rate for each agency is different. Some agencies, it's 13%. And other agencies, it might be upwards of 30%. It's highly competitive. You have to make sure every I's dotted, every T's crossed, every form's filled out correctly. And when they say font size no smaller than 10, they're not kidding. They're looking for a reason to kick you out and not fund you. So be mindful of that. And if you're good at following instructions and filling out forms, you stay in an okay shop.
Entrepreneur following instructions. Okay, I'm seeing.
Yeah. Sometimes that doesn't. Yeah.
But your point is well taken. So let's say I'm a founder. I'm clearly not living in the academic world, on the grant world. I'm just trying to get my business off the ground. How do I make an intelligent assessment of where I have a shot? Like which agency I'm likely to have a better shot? Is there data out there that I can pull up?
I mean, you can certainly go to sbir.gov and you'll see previously awarded companies. And I advise anyone that's looking at SBIR, go see what they've funded in the past. No, just because they haven't funded exactly what you're proposing or what you want to do doesn't mean there isn't an opportunity for you. But you know that if something's near similar, or maybe it is even a competitor and they funded a competitor, then okay, there's a line in for you. We always say, talk to the program officer, talk to them about what they're focused on. So if we're talking about like dental AI to detect cavities, that might be a really good fit in the National Institute of Health, but it might be a good fit for the National Science Foundation because you're doing something really novel and innovative with that AI that may have other applied uses outside of the dental industry. You may be able to do something in another industry or another field, like have a conversation with them and see, email them, call them, talk to them. The worst that could happen is they don't talk to you, or be persistent, talk to them, have conversations about appropriateness, fit. Would they be receptive to even an executive summary from you? Not a pitch deck, just an executive summary of what you're trying to do and what you think you're going to accomplish with the outcomes.
That is a fantastic segue into the process itself. Speaking about SBIR and STTR, what are the basic building blocks or foundational pieces that I have to have in place as a founder before I think about this? And then we'll talk about the process.
Okay, so the first things first is federal registrations. SAM.gov is priority one. That can take 6 weeks to validate. And you can't submit any application to any federal agency without that being active and valid. However you registered with the IRS, including capitalization, spelling, periods, you name it, make sure it's exactly the same way in SAM.gov. You don't want to give SAM.gov a reason to delay your approval process. And a lot of times we get startups that come to us and say, hey, the application's due next week. Can you do this? No, you didn't even do your SAM registration. It's 6 weeks to validate just SAM. There are organizations out there that you can pay to have them do it for you, but I firmly believe it is in a startup's best interest to do it themselves. It's not complex. There's a lot of forms to click through and make sure that it's set up for your business, but you'll need things like your tax ID, banking information, that sort of thing. It's their system of award management, and it's for all federal agencies. If there's one-stop shop, the one thing that they have right now is SAM.gov for everyone. So you have that. That's mandatory, 6 weeks to approval. And you need to set yourself a calendar reminder to renew it annually. So that is a thing that could trip you up. Just because you're registered and it's active and valid now doesn't mean it will be next year. So there's that. You will also need to be cognizant of timelines. And there's some other things that come into play there. But if you have a due date, and let's talk about National Institute of Health, SBIR happens 3 times a year, January 5th, April 5th, and September 5th, 3 times a year. Depending on where you are in the process of going through the registration and where you are in the calendar year when you finally listen to this, you have to think about what's reasonable and doable in the timeline. If you go for the January 5th deadline, you've got a whole slew of holidays in your way. And the last thing you want to do is be fretting about your proposal to NIH during the holidays. We advise our clients try to be done by December 20th. And I know that people are like, well, you got until the 5th. Yeah, but your holidays are stressful enough. Be done December 20th. And then what we recommend, go back even farther. I would encourage someone to start working on their proposals 45 days out from the deadline. But you need to be mindful of your timelines and think about, is it realistic and achievable to meet the deadline? We also tell our clients, be done 7 calendar days in advance of the deadline. That 7 calendar day window is for uploading into their system, their platform, which, as a side note, just because you did SAM.gov, your registrations aren't done yet. There's more. Each agency has their own platform and turnaround time frame. ERA Commons can take 2 weeks. So you've got the 6-week. Once that's approved, then there's an additional potential for 2 weeks for ERA Commons through the National Institute of Health. Sometimes it's quicker, sometimes it takes longer, depends on what's going on, but assume another 2 weeks. So we're talking about 8 weeks here that could potentially be just held up before you even put pen to paper, just dealing with registrations. So we say 7 calendar days in advance, you want to be done. And that's to upload into the platform and no more editing, no more modifying, no more waiting on letters. You're ready to load. And the reason we say that window is if it can go wrong, it will. Your internet will go out. Your computer will die. There'll be a major family crisis of some kind. Don't chance it. That 7 calendar day window there is for your own sanity. So that's just dealing with the timelines. Then there is, are you even in a position to go for this funding? Do you have not only yourself, competency, capability, and expertise to be the lead on the project, be the PI, the principal investigator, but also do you have subject matter expertise? Do you have a development person? Do you have an AI expert with you? Do you have a development person who can help write the code? If you're talking about dental and we're talking about AI, do you have a dental clinician? Do you have an expert surrounding x-rays and someone who does this, an industry expert on your team? No, they can be a W-2 employee or a 1099. You need a team. You cannot do a single person application for SBIR. This is meant for a team who's going to do the work should it be awarded. Now, it can be a mix of W-2 and 1099s. That's a whole separate conversation about budgets and what's allowable and not allowable. But you need to have a team of experts, advisors, and you have to be able to do the work should it be awarded. And I go back to that Series A lift. And you get Series A, your work's just starting. You've got to meet with your investors and do what they want. It's the same thing. You've got to start doing what the government wants, surrounding yourself with a competent and capable team of doing the work, and then making sure that that opportunity is a fit for you. Everything's going to look fantastic because you're going to see all these dollars running around and $1 billion in funding, and you just got to get a slice of the pie. But again, I go back to the funding should fit you. You should not fit the funding. Make sure you're eligible. That's important. Make sure you are capable of doing what they are looking for in the proposal. And then, of course, there's the myriad of documentation that goes with the whole proposal process that needs to be completed.
Maybe we can just walk through very quickly a high-level hypothetical. Let's say I come to you, I'm a startup founder, I have an AI, ML, something for dental diagnosis. We'll run with that. So you talked about got through the registrations, I have the team of experts. What are the 3 or 4 basic things? Like, how do I assess eligibility? What are the bullet points, the highlights that you'd ask that I look for or look at before even considering applying?
So the big thing is with the eligibility, and if we're just talking about your business, the bigger things are, of course, you need to be legally formed. You need to be able to have your team. That's the big thing. Complete your registrations, whatever that agency is looking for. Your team members need to be in the US or eligible to work in the US. It's got to be here. And you can do remote work in the US, but outside of the borders of the US, they get a little funny about that. And then your founding team, whoever that is, whoever the owners are, if you own less than 50% of your company, you're not going to be able to do SBIR. It's a limitation on that. If you're the inventor of the product and you don't have the required expertise, you got to surround yourself with the team and the expertise. And this is the big one, but it's not overtly obvious. If your company's been around for 5 years or more and you've had little traction, why now? Why SBIR now? No, you could have been around for 10 years and you're now developing something. Okay, but if your innovation's been around for more than 5 years, you're going to have a hard time selling that to the government. That doesn't mean you're out of the loop completely, but just be careful of that. As far as the technology itself, whatever it is you're developing, if you don't have milestones, if you don't have an understanding of technical risk and mitigation strategies, that's not in place. If your product is reliant on a manual process as opposed to some type of automation, there's a problem there. A lot of times clients come to us and there's just not sufficient innovation. They're like, well, I'm going to build an app. Well, an app is not innovative in the eyes of the government. I mean, the app needs to happen. Yes, it would be useful, but maybe SBIR is not for you. There's got to be a technical challenge or a technical risk behind that. And if you haven't done your background work, done the lit review, and as I mentioned earlier, go to SBIR, see if they've funded other similar or near similar. You got to do the literature review and bring the evidence that there's a potentiality that this could work. And a lack of significant deliverables and outcomes is sometimes an issue as well. You're like, yeah, we're going to just scan your teeth and you're going to have cavities. Well, that's not enough. What are the different stages of cavity in degradation? Like, there's a whole bunch of things that have to come into play there. And what does that end product look like? The other thing with this is not knowing the market at all. Have not done any customer discovery. And the differentiator between what the market wants versus what the market needs, if you can't tell the difference between that, or your end user versus the person signing the check or the one who has power of purse, being able to differentiate those things, those are important things. And probably one of the bigger red flags, if you're desperate for funding, this is not the place. SBIR is not the place for those that are desperate for funding. This is a well thought out and methodical process. And the turnaround time on grant awards is not quick. You may have submitted yesterday to NIH's April 5th deadline. You're not going to know the outcome till maybe September. And you may not be starting until December. That's how the government is. It can be in 6 months before you know the outcome of your funding opportunity. So if you're desperate for funding, SBIR is not the place for you. It just isn't. It's meant for well thought out investigative research to demonstrate outcomes.
So this brings up an excellent question. So if I were to kind of step back, and what I heard was, if you look at the eligibility and the requirements, regardless of which agency, there are some, what I'll call domicile and other hygiene factors of what you need to check the box on before you can even, so that's bucket one. Then there's bucket two, which I heard around, technically, do you fit the bill? Do you bring really something innovative? And you better make sure, bring the receipts to show that.
Yes, exactly. That's a really good way of saying it. Bring your receipts.
So that's bucket number two. And then the bucket number 3 that I heard is the commercial viability and your mastery of the commercial opportunity and being able to link that back to the technical innovation that you want to pursue and progress.
Absolutely. So you have your business, bucket 1, that's universal across all SBIRs. Doesn't matter which one, NIH, NSF, DOD, there are fundamental rules for SBIR for your business. Then there is the technical innovation requirement, and it might be slightly different between DOT, DOD, NSF, Department of Ed, what they're looking for, but they all are going to ask about the market potentiality and the market risk. They're going to want to know that there is a potentiality for traction there should you launch this into the market space.
Excellent. So now I've decided that I am going to fit the bill. I'm not fitting the funding fits me. I want to go ahead. Can you give a high-level walkthrough of what the grant application process looks like and what I need to be prepared for as a founder?
Okay, so first things first, there's a common theme here. Registrations are the first thing. Do those first. Second thing is you need to confirm your eligibility. Nothing like getting halfway through the application process to realize that maybe you formed as a nonprofit as opposed to a for-profit. You really need to confirm your eligibility status. And that's just dealing with the business and meeting all of the eligibility criteria for the business. Things like your tax ID, SAM, all of those things. Just that's the first thing. Then there are the instructions for the solicitation. Some of them will be very nuanced about, can you have human subjects involved or can you not have human subjects involved? You have the solicitation instructions. You also have the agency instructions. So you have to be mindful to be able to dance between those two sets of instructions. In the agency instructions, there'll be things like page limitations, font, how they want tables to look. Can you highlight things in red or yellow? Like how they want all proposals coming in the door. Then there is the solicitation instructions, which go over the questions and in the order they want you to answer them. And some advice that we tell our clients, they're like, well, this doesn't flow. This doesn't make sense. It's not supposed to. It's not supposed to flow. Answer the questions in the order they are asking them. And don't skip a question. If you don't have an answer, you still have to answer. If it doesn't apply to you, say, this doesn't apply to me, and then move on to the next one. You don't want to give the reviewers a reason to think you overlook something or you're not answering a question. You just follow the instructions. Answer all parts of the question. If you have a question statement that's like, is it yellow and red? Don't just say it's yellow. You've got to say it's also red. There's 2-part questions, lots of run-on sentences that you have to address all elements for it. There are webinars, attend webinars. There may be Q&A sessions, go to them. No question is too small. That's what they're there for. Some agencies have dark periods where once the solicitation is out, you can't ask any questions from the time the solicitation comes out to the time that it's due. So you need to be conscientious of that. And if you have questions, get a hold of them, call them, email them. And no question is too small. Like I said, my only caveat to that is if the question is answerable in the 2 sets of instructions, the solicitation and the agency instructions, don't bog down the program officer going, what's the budget limit? It's in the solicitation. Don't ask them that. It's there. But it may be more nuanced questions like, am I allowed to spend money on Twizzlers? That may not be obvious in the instructions. Okay, fine. Ask the program officer, can I buy Twizzlers? Because we want to show teeth damage with sugar. I don't know what you're... I keep going back to the dental thing because I do have a dental appointment tomorrow. But it's following through with that and work backwards from the timeline of when you want to be done and start planning things out, collecting letters of support. If they say you're capped at 3 letters of support, they're not kidding. They won't even look at letter number 4, and that could be the one that could have sealed the deal for you. If they say 1-page letterhead with a signature, they are not kidding. They want letterhead. They want a signature on that letter. So read every single piece of detail and nuance about what's allowable, not allowable, and what those expectations are. It is an undertaking, no doubt. And that's why I say it is like going after Series A. And in some instances, it may be a little bit more complex. But if you just take your time, read through everything, do it the old school method, print it off, grab a highlighter and start highlighting things and have it in front of you. That is the best thing to do.
So this gives me a really granular picture of how heavy of a lift it is. Taking a step back again, I'm a founder. I have to create a strategy for my entire capital stack. Based on what you're saying, it sounds to me like if I'm going to pursue government funding as a bucket of capital, I'd better prepare for the long haul.
Yes, it is a marathon, not a sprint.
And to that point, I'd better prepare for the long haul, and I'd better at least tweak my business model and my go-to-market approach, for lack of a better word, to align with what a government might need. And then also have a backup option for funding, because it feels definitely a lower probability, less than a certainty for sure. I mean, 13% or 30%, majority of the time you're still going to get rejected, right? Even if it's 30%.
Yeah, you're going to get, there's an upshot to this. You're going to get rejected. This just going to happen. And that's not the end of the world if you do. So the one thing as founders know, you're going to get told no a lot. You are going to make mistakes. You are going to screw things up. This comes with it. This is part of the screwing things up. So with SBIR, after that deadline, when they get into that decision-making window, afterwards, you will get comments and scores back from the reviewers. You won't know who the reviewers are. It'll be anonymous, but you will get your scores and your comments. And a lot of times, most of the time, your reviewers have really constructive things and feedback for you. And you can resubmit your application, make the modifications, adjustments based upon what the reviewers had to say. Then you go from 13 to 30% likelihood of success. You're going to jump up to 60% likelihood of success because you're resubmitting, you're making the corrections, you're making the adjustments based upon reviewer feedback. And if you address everything and score really well, you're in a much better shot. I just had a client yesterday that resubmitted their application. They scored really well, but they were just a hair under fundability. And they were just minor adjustments that the reviewers, and they're subject matter experts, they know that industry, they know mental health really, really well. They're like, hey, when you do this, you should account for that. How are you addressing this? And they're like, oh, it didn't occur to us that we had to address for, I use an example, it didn't occur to them that they would have to think about multiple languages. They're like, oh, English. And I'm like, maybe you should consider either simultaneously developing a Spanish language version or have it as Spanish language for phase 2. But make sure the reviewers know that that's in the queue, because to them, you're just doing English. And they're like, well, what about Spanish speakers? What about other languages within the United States? Like, how do you address these things in the mental health space? And they're like, just that aha moment. But it causes you to go back and refine things. And it's an exercise in business development and your systems and your processes. So even if you aren't funded and you ultimately don't resubmit and you're maybe courting investors or whatever, this really is an exercise of like getting your paperwork together and really knowing your product and mapping out your timelines and what you need to do and understanding what the true budget is to really do something like that. So when you are talking to investors, you can say, look, I know this is going to cost me 1.5 million just to do this, to get it to market, blah, 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 because you've already done the research. You did it for an SBIR application. You already know that space. It makes it much easier to court investors. You have developed that knowledge and expertise, and it's useful in other applied areas. So just because you aren't funded, it's not the end of the world. You shouldn't be desperate for government funding, but it'll help you down the road should you pursue other funding. And of course, you can always resubmit an application in the next cohort window if you're willing to play the game for another 6 months.
I just love the point you made around how there are some ancillary benefits as well, even if you don't get the funding. That point is extremely well taken. So you have seen a lot of applications from startups. for government funding, what are the most common reasons, if you had to bucket them, for grants getting rejected?
Not following the instructions. We sometimes are pulled in to review an application. What client wants to, can you double check, make sure we dotted our I's and crossed our T's? And we'll go back to them and be like, you didn't answer the questions. Font, page length, budgetary allowance issues, just following the instructions alone is like the number one thing. The number two thing is not being a fit for the funding opportunity. What they're proposing doesn't even remotely align with what the agency wants to do. They're going to build Joe's Pizza Shack and they're chasing NSF because they think they need a pizza oven. No. I can't tell you how many times we've brought in, I'm like, yeah, I'd love to talk. And there's no engineering. There's no scientific knowledge. There's no scientific methodology involved. They're just not even there for it. Following the instructions, alignment, those are the fundamental things. And if you can cross those hurdles, if you can put together a compelling proposal, follow the instructions, have the research methodology in place, you're going to be given deep consideration by the reviewers. Whether or not you're funded, that's a different story, but at least be given deep consideration. And yes, we want our clients funded, but we want them in a position that the reviewers can give them deep consideration and give them good scores. Obviously, we want that, but also meaningful feedback that can help them evolve and grow as a startup. So sometimes the end game isn't always funding. It's their evolution as a startup is where they need to be.
And to that point, let's assume that the registration part is done, but just for the substantive part of the grant application itself, what's a reasonable time frame? Let's say they're doing it on their own.
Doing it themselves, I would anticipate probably 250 hours of their time.
The founders, the subject matter experts' time.
250 hours of time. And that is not like 40 hours a week, 7 days a week. It is, you have to walk away, think about things, set things down, come back, talk to someone, you're waiting for an email, that sort of thing. Minimally 250 hours of your time to do it.
Typically, from a calendar perspective, is that like 3 months, 4 months?
Yeah, it's about 3 months worth of work. As a startup, you're doing other things. You got lots of irons in the fire. Just to do this is about 250 hours of time. It's going to be about 3 months worth of work. Getting everything in place, getting all your methodology, ironing out what you want to do, making sure that you've got letters of support and collaborators and subject matter experts and that your budget is worked out and what you're proposing is doable and achievable in the time you are proposing.
So I want to touch briefly on one other source of support from the government, which is non-dilutive, which is, you referred to it earlier in terms of contracts, maybe other tax incentives, things of that nature. Can you give a very high level overview at the federal level of what those might be and how the founders' approach to securing that support would differ? What are the things that are different and what should they do differently to identify and then procure those opportunities?
Yeah, so contracts, let's start with that. Contracts at a really high level, think of them like grants. Similar concept, you're not going to lose your equity. You will have deliverables at the end. So if we're talking, going back to the dental AI detection for cavities, they may come out with a solicitation that says, we need someone to build an AI model that will detect cavities in teeth. Okay. At the end of that contract, they want you delivering an AI model that can, without a doubt, 100% detect cavities in teeth. That's what they want. They are your customer at that point. They expect it to work. They have a time frame. So a little bit similar to a grant, not exactly the same, but there's a deliverable at the end. Now, again, grants.gov, great resource. SAM.gov, have a look in there. It's a great place to look for contracts. And there's all sorts of third-party websites that are out there for that. And as far as tax incentives go, talk to your accountant. Your accountant should know these things already. Sometimes they don't. And there's nothing wrong with it. But if they do, they should be making sure that your taxes reflect that you're doing R&D and that you're taking advantage of those tax credits. Now, some states have different tax credits and this and that and the other things going on. And then there's a whole slew of different types of tax credits. But yeah, take advantage of those. Sometimes it's workforce development credits, or you might be in an opportunity or a hub zone or something to take advantage of in your state. So yeah.
Excellent. So I'm going to get in our time machine and jump forward. You've gotten whatever support it is. You've gotten your grant. Now you're happy. You got a check. What are the things that the founder needs to be aware of and maintain to still stay within the borders of what the grant said? What are their obligations?
So remember, you got the grant because you said you were going to do XYZ. Now you actually have to do XYZ. When in doubt, communicate with your program officer, whoever your point of contact is. I always say err on the side of transparency. If you have to swap out an engineer because people change positions all the time, people leave, come and go, make sure that their skills and ability and expertise is equal to or better than the person you're swapping out. But talk to your program officer, let them know that you're doing it. Overshare. Tell them what's going on. If you said you're going to do something in 6 months, you have to do it in 6 months. It's the federal government. That's the first thing. Make sure your accountant knows how to classify those grant dollars within your accounting system in your books, because it doesn't sit in the same location that you think it does. And your accountant needs to know where that goes and where those dollars are going to. There's also reporting requirements, and every agency is different as far as what they're going to look for and the type of reporting that they're going to want back. Again, communicate with your program officer about when those deadlines are, what is expected in those reports. And you can always ask for sample reports if possible. Maybe there's NDAs that have to be signed so you can see what a completed one looks like. But again, it goes back to following the timeline. If they want something by June 1st, you have to start planning backwards of when to put it in your program officer's hands so that you don't get dinged for not completing reports on time. Not spending the dollars the way that you said you were going to spend dollars in for each of the budget line item things. If wildly out of line, that could be a felony. I'm not kidding. Like, misappropriation of federal dollars is a felony. And there's all sorts of government regulations for it. So I don't want to scare anyone, but get an accountant. There's a difference between a bookkeeper and accountant. Get both. Make sure that your books are reconciled and up to date, and you're paying attention to how those grant dollars sit within your system and making sure that you're utilizing them the right way. It's up to you as the founder to make sure things are happening the way that you said they were going to happen. And if they're not, you got to err on the side of transparency and reconcile that right away. So if you said you're going to develop the AI model for the cavity recognition, guess what? It's not a time to develop an AI model to work on toenails. No, that's not what you said you were doing. So you got to do what you said you were going to do. You're entering into agreement with the federal government. No one wants to do that dance with the federal government if you don't do what you say you want to do.
Now, clearly, we live in a world where Murphy's Law operates, and many times things go awry. So it sounds like there is a red zone, which is clearly way off what you said you were going to do and outside the purpose of the grant. So understood. Then there's a green zone, which is exactly what you said you were going to do. Then there's a yellow zone. So how big is that yellow zone, and how do you navigate? Because things are uncertain. I mean, that's the whole point of R&D. And
right. So let's say you develop some objectives within your proposal and you're not getting outcomes. And there may be something else that has to be addressed. Again, go back to your program officer and talk to them. And again, I always go back to err on the side of transparency with them, almost like a shadow team member is what they end up turning into. You want to let them know, look, we're not getting the outcomes. We've done XYZ, and it's just not working the way we thought. We're not achieving our objectives. You're not going to get dinged for not achieving your objectives because you tried. You'll get dinged for not achieving your objectives if you don't try. That's the thing. You have to try. You have to show some good effort and meaningful effort to trying to get to those outcomes. And they're going to want to see that meaningful effort and walk them through, like, here's what we did, and it's not working, and we don't know why, and maybe we're using the wrong AI model, and we're going to need a 3-month extension. Talk to your program officer. Again, err on the side of caution and just be transparent with them. Things happen. Hurricanes happen. Tornadoes happen. Power outages, floods. They get it. Those are things that are outside of your control. But again, communicate with your program officer.
So when the grant is given, do they say, hey, you have to communicate with us, you have to submit a monthly report? Almost sounds like they're a shadow board member, if you will.
Kind of, sort of. It's more like, depending on how long your grant award is, would dictate how often they want reporting. It's typically like every couple of months. So it'd probably be like every 3 to 6 months. If you get a 6-month grant, they're going to want an interim report. They want some things in the interim. And of course, there's a wrap-up report at the end. But yeah, in a way, almost like a shadow board member. It was called like a shadow C-suite individual. They're not going to be involved day-to-day operations, but when it comes to the grant, talk to them. And when you get awarded that grant, you're going to be talking to them. They're going to say, hey, my name is Bob. This is what I do. You just loop them in. And sometimes program officers will tell you how much they want to know or don't know. They will say, look, only call me if someone's burning, bleeding, or on fire, or someone died. And then you get other program officers. They're like, every time you blink, I want to talk to you. Okay. So it just depends on their capacity, what they want to see. But I always say, when in doubt, just err on the side of transparency and communicate with them.
So if I get a program manager who's the Bob who only wants to be told if somebody's on fire, is it still okay, or will I annoy them by just sending like a non-intrusive monthly update that...
Do it. Just do it. Yeah, just do it. And then you have that record of communication to protect yourself as a small business, because the last thing you ever want is, well, no one ever told me there was a problem. You need to have that paper trail to protect yourself.
Okay. So let's say you come to the end of your 3 months or 6 months, your grant period is over. You did or didn't achieve your outcome, but you did this job that you said you were going to do. So you discharged your obligation to try. Is there a closure? Like, does it come to an end? And then what are your obligations? Let's say you develop some IP as a result of that. What are your obligations with regard to the grant? And then after that, if you can talk about what are your rights and obligations with regard to any IP that you developed, that would be fantastic.
Well, in theory, your IP was developed before you submitted the application. You own the IP. You're not giving that up to the government. The government doesn't want your IP. They don't want anything to do with it. And I'll say with that, with the caveat, there's rare instance where they'll be like, we'd be interested in buying that from you. So it depends. It's very rare. It happens. Think DOD in that realm. So the IP should already be locked down on your end prior to grant application. This is submitting your patents, making sure that you've gone through that process. As far as the grant obligation goes itself, when your 6 months is up and you submit your final report, that's it. You're done. You might be eligible. Talking to your program officer, they may encourage you to go on for a phase 2. They may say, look, you weren't successful. We would encourage you to reapply on another phase 1 because you got to do XYZ in order to get to those outcomes. They may say that to you, but you're under no obligation to go for a phase 2. You're under no obligation to go for an additional phase 1. You may decide that's not worth chasing, or you're going to market anyway and you don't need the government. That's fine too. But when you're done, you're done. That's it.
Got it. So this may or may not be a feasible question, but have you ever seen instances, or can you think of circumstances where I might apply for more than one source of funding within that same time window? So let's say I'm developing something that could be eligible for a Department of Energy and a Department of Transportation.
Sure. Yeah, you absolutely can. So there's a couple of different approach processes there. You certainly can apply to as many agencies that fit what you're trying to do. Now, I always say, I use the analogy of building a car. You can only accept one grant award for building the car. You cannot have multiple grant awards for the car. Now, if you break it down into smaller bite-sized chunks, maybe you're working on a steering wheel or a seatbelt or the battery or whatever. You can have multiple different grants doing multiple different things, getting you where you need to go, multiple agencies, but you can only take one steering wheel grant. So there's that. Some agencies will let you have multiple applications in. Some will not. So you have to be careful of that. And again, it goes back to reading the instructions. Are you allowed to have multiple applications into NSF? NSF will only let you submit one active pitch at a time. NIH, you can have as many as you want, hammer down. You can do phase 1, you can skip right to phase 2. You can do a fast track, which is a phase 1 and a phase 2 at the same time. They'll let you go nuts, hammer down. Sure, they welcome it. NSF, nope, one at a time. You need to know your agency and what they want to see. Some are very clear what they want. Some are like, yeah, wide open, hammer down, go.
So now clearly all the talk with VC funds drying up and the Inflation Reduction Act is all around funding from the government. Can you talk about what trends you're seeing from the startup side in terms of where the dollars are, what the startups are doing that would be useful to founders?
So what we're seeing is everyone's taking like just a big deep breath right now. Do I need to be going for VC? Do I need to be going for angel investors? Is there a way to push this to market without that investment? Maybe I'm going to scale a little bit slower than I would if I had chased angel investors or Series A or whatever. But we're also seeing people pay attention to funding opportunities to the federal government. It's making this space a little bit more competitive when it comes to grants. We're also seeing an uptick in pitch competitions and accelerators where there isn't an equity tied to it, which is fine. That's great. However, you can get those seed dollars in the door and you're still aiming for a specific launch date, or you've already launched, or you have some revenue coming in. Those are all good things. But we're seeing like a little bit of a deep breath right now. And everyone's like, okay, I need to reassess what I'm doing. Should I even be chasing VC? Our clients are talking to us and they're saying there's the typical due diligence, but now there's like a deeper dive into how stable is that VC? Where are they doing their banking? And just being a little bit more cognizant of that. But it's nice to see that there's plenty of federal dollars to go around. It's just a matter of, do they fit what you're trying to do?
So has any of that funding strategy changed on the startups? I mean, are you seeing like a huge stampede at the gates of these grants?
Not really. And I guess we won't really know until like some of the funding deadlines pass, when the agencies release how many applications they receive. Every time there's a cohort round, they say, hey, we received X number of applications and we funded this many. So we really won't know those outcomes on, was there a giant onslaught of applications coming in the door? Probably for another 6 months or so, because it takes the government a really long time to disclose that information. They ultimately do, but it'll take some time.
Got it. And then the specific focus and the sweet spot, or I guess a soft spot for this podcast, is for women and diverse women entrepreneurs. Do you have any words of counsel in terms of how they can tweak their sourcing strategy for non-dilutive grants?
This is something that we pay a lot of attention to for underrepresented populations. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is get certified as an underrepresented founder. You can do that through the SBA. There's a self-certification process as a women-owned business or a minority-owned business or an economically disadvantaged or a veteran-owned. Do the self-certification. Do it, get it done. It's not mandatory for any funding, but it's a little badge you can have on your company website that we're certified women-owned business. And it might help investors pay attention to you a little bit more. Then I would encourage you to do your certification at your state level. Some states are easier than others. And again, that application process can be a little arduous and time consuming. I know for myself, no knock on New York State, but definitely was an exercise in making sure I had all my documents together. And it's a learning process for you as a business owner. You need to know where these documents are and where you store them. And do you have these things, and getting all your paperwork together. It's not a quick certification process at the state level. It does take time because they really do check you out and make sure that you are who you say you are. As far as specific funding for underrepresented populations, the dollars are out there. They're not as plentiful as they are at the federal level. You'll see grants that could range anywhere from $5,000, $50,000, maybe $75,000 or $100,000, but you're not going to see like $1 million grant for a women-owned business. It's very tiny. Whereas the federal government could be $275,000 to $1 million, well over $1 million, depending on what's going on. The thing to be aware of is when you do your federal application, if you're doing an SBIR, there is an option to check a box, whether you're women-owned, minority-owned, but there's no competitive preference points if you select that box. There's an argument to be made about not even disclosing that you're a women-owned business at the federal level. This is kind of like the dark side or the downside of this is reviewers are still humans. And they have perceptions about business owners for whatever reason. They see your name, they see that you're a woman, they'll ask you the same questions that a VC would be asking you. They may not have the mechanism to ask the question, but they may judge you or score you differently because you are a woman-owned business, or maybe your product is women-centric. That's another thing, like femtech can maybe not be receptive to reviewers for whatever reason, maybe because they're men. They don't understand the applied commercial use for that. So there's that to deal with as well. But I always recommend do your certifications. There's not really a competitive advantage other than just checking the box at the federal level so that they can say how many women receive funding and minorities and economically disadvantaged and veteran-owned. I wish there was. I wish there was specific competitive preference points for underrepresented populations, but there really isn't. It is what it is. It's something that I continuously am talking about on a regular basis, about just even how the data is collected. I have some arguments with some agencies on Twitter about how they handle their data. I wish it was a cut and dry answer. Like I said, the women and minority and underrepresented grants tend to be smaller. They're out there. They're just as competitive as the federal level. They're not as paperwork heavy, but they are quite competitive.
Would you say that the same holds for contracts as well?
Contracts, it's a little bit different. There are set-asides. So I believe New York State, for example, they aim to have, I think it's like 30%. I could be wrong about this number. It's either 30 or 15% of the contracts go to underrepresented populations. And if you have your certifications in place, that'll make that process a little bit easier. At the federal level, same thing. There's a certain percentile that they set aside to go to underrepresented populations. Again, your certifications are going to play a role in that in the contract space. I wish it was a little bit easier to talk about, but that's all there is to that one.
Fantastic. This has been a supremely comprehensive, educational, and informative conversation. So thank you for really diving into the details. So just to conclude, what would you say are the top 5 do's and don'ts for a woman founder who is looking at government funding as a potential source of capital?
Persistence is the first thing. You have to be willing to come to the table many times over and over again. You're going to get rejected. And just own the rejection, learn from it, evolve from it, reapply. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not quick turnaround by any means. The U.S. government is very slow moving with that regard. So those are the big things. Follow the instructions. Make sure the funding opportunity fits what you want to do. And then probably the last thing is if you don't have capacity, get help. Get consultants that can help you do the application. We can take some things off of your plate. And I dive into this a little bit. There's a perception out there among grant professionals. Well, I'll just have them write the grant. Okay, well, I'm not a subject matter expert in machine learning. The funders are going to expect that you're the expert in machine learning. I can make sure that, all your bullet points and everything's filled out and you have really good grammar and all your budgets in alignment. And I can find logic leaps and what you're proposing to do and that sort of thing. But I'm not going to be able to write your algorithm formula for you. You should be doing that. My job is to prepare your proposal. And as far as what the R&D is going to be, that's on you. And then the other piece of advice that I have, and this is something I don't know where it comes from. When you hire professional, whether it's a commercialization professional, whether it's a grant professional, it's fee for service. You can't do contingency funding, pay them if the grant award gets funded. You can't do that. That's not an allowable expense. Can't use the grant dollars to pay for services rendered prior to the grant award. I go back to that conversation about misappropriation of funds and doing that dance with the IRS. No one wants to do that. So just be cognizant of that. Not every professional has subject matter expertise in non-dilutive funding, working with startups. Some focus on grassroots organizations. Like for us, we work in the non-dilutive space. We work with startups all day long.
Great. So this has been superb. I think you summed it up really well. So is there anything I should have asked you but didn't?
I don't think so. I think the big thing is we talked about certifications. We talked about timeline, time management. How much of a lift is it really going to be? And there's advantages and disadvantages to go into funding. We talked about all the things, and I'm hard pressed to think off the top of my head if there was something that we talked about, but I'm always happy to field questions. If anyone's got questions or they, need time, they have some questions about funding opportunities, I'm happy to have those conversations.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. This has been a really amazing conversation. You've been very generous with your time and insights and expertise. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My conversation with Christine was full of new and fascinating insights into the world of government grants. There's a ton of gold to mine here, and I took away 3 big things that really stood out for me. First, making the decision to go down the grants route is a strategic choice you make for your startup, and it's not one that you should make lightly. It's a huge lift and a hit on resources. The level of preparation, the attention to detail, the timing, the importance of procedural requirements, the low likelihood of success, the iterative nature of grant applications make this a whole other animal in the world of funding resources. Proceed with intention. Second, my conversation with Christine helped me appreciate a lot more clearly that you have essentially no chance of getting funded if you don't have a team that's specifically assembled for a technical or scientific purpose. As a for-profit startup, of course, this doesn't preclude you, but it may mean that you look at your team configuration with a whole new lens. My biggest takeaway, however, was this: apply only if the funding fits you and don't try to fit the funding. This can be hard to stick to when the dollars are big and other sources are running dry, but it's smart to stick to your startup's purpose and mission rather than pivot just to have a shot at qualifying. This sounded like a really wise perspective to me, and frankly, one that I think could apply to life as well. So, what was your biggest aha moment about the world of government grants? And what one actionable tip did you take away? Thanks for listening to today's episode. We have show notes and more at achieve.co. That's achieve.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe and share with a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go be an achiever.